これはどうしたんだ?
This video is sponsored by Skillshare. If you want to learn how to use editing software, like what I used to make this video, check the link provided below for 2 free months of Skillshare Premium to try it out yourself. You know, it can be a challenge to escape from your legacy when something you create does well, as that's what everyone starts to associate you with and will compare anything that comes after it to. Pretty much anyone that hears FromSoft is developing a game immediately assumes it's going to be some type of Souls-like, and is likely disappointed when it isn't. NetherRealm Studios, on the other hand, can't make anything without someone asking if there's going to be a fatality in it. And with Ryuga Gotoku Studio, it's the Yakuza series. For the longest time, the Yakuza games have been a pillar of Sega's publishing. Despite its shaky localization history in the West, meaning it didn't fully take off until the last few years or so outside of Japan, it still found a very dedicated fanbase. And it's kind of easy to see why, as there aren't a lot of games like them. Mixing together bombastic stories delving into the world of the Yakuza, fun and charming characters, and some of the goofiest yet enjoyable side quests in any games. Honestly, any game that lets you beat thugs unconscious with a street sign and then go do karaoke that transforms into an 80s pop video pretty much has me sold. With Yakuza 6 though, it was decided by the Yakuza team at Sega that it was time to end Kiryu Kazuma's story after 7 games spread across more than a decade. Because how many times can one man be at the center of a bunch of political intrigue and Yakuza betrayals while trying to run an orphanage? So it was announced that any future Yakuza type games after 6 would be focusing on a new protagonist and storyline, which has fans both excited and apprehensive on what that could mean for the series going forward. Because what would a Yakuza game without Kiryu look like? Which obviously brings us to the main topic of this video, with Judgment, aka Judge Eyes, the recent detective drama / Yakuza style game. While technically a spin-off, looking at Judgment might give a good idea of how RGG Studio is going to continue now that they no longer have the Dragon of Dojima around. And I better talk about this now before there's another scandal with a Yakuza actor that causes Sega to take it all down. So, how well does Judgment take on the legacy of Yakuza, while possibly expanding on what that can be? Now, at the surface level, a lot of what Judgment is just as another Yakuza style of game, which isn't a wrong way to look at it. It clearly recycles the structure, animations, and location of the Yakuza series. From a passing glance, it's the same package with a new coat of paint. However, dig a little bit deeper and you'll find there's more going on here, because much of how Judgment tries to define itself is how it differentiates from the Yakuza games. When talking about why they decided to do a different game like this, series creator and director Noshihiro Nagoshi stated that it was meant to be a new challenge for the team, taking all the experience they developed over the last decade or so and using it to create something different. So everything from the music, tone, mechanics, and characters of Judgment are meant to reflect this different approach to the franchise going into a new genre. To start, and possibly the most important part, is that the new protagonist, Takayuki Yagami, is not Kiryu. Because he was so central to the main series, in past spin-off Yakuza games, there's always been a Kiryu stand-in or equivalent, often just modeling everything right off of him. Nagoshi even stated that they developed the series around Kiryu, and the rules of what a Yakuza game was centered around him. So in order to approach that from a different angle, for all intents and purposes, Yagami was very much made to be his own character, with his own backstory and arc to work through, and everything ended up being built off that mentality. Yagami isn't this stoic, noble force walking through Kamurocho, but is instead made out to be a more cocky, fallen from grace detective living there, who's simply trying to find justice in a system that's overall indifferent to it. In terms of scope, Yagami feels like a more down-to-earth character for a protagonist in this universe, fitting the smaller scale that the game starts off with. At the beginning, everything is centered around investigating a local serial killer. But as the story opens up, the scope expands beyond just Yagami and Kamurocho, with the larger plot intertwining Yagami's vindication and overcoming the ghost of his past into what's currently going on within the city and world around it. But for all the tragedy and moral complexity, Yagami's still the type that would try to fit an old school pinball machine into his already cramped apartment/office, or attempt to fix an air conditioning unit by kicking it. With Yagami being an ex-defense lawyer who exiles himself into working as a detective, finding justice inside and outside of the confines of the court, you get an interesting mix of lawyer from classic courtroom thrillers with the hardened kung fu detectives a la Hong Kong crime dramas like Chapeau Lang and Flashpoint. But what Judgment and Yagami himself take the most cues from is the highly popular Japanese series Hero, a legal drama centered around a quirky public prosecutor who solves cases by going out into the streets and doing his own investigations, which also stars Takuya Kimura, the actor who Yagami was based on. So for American audiences, this would be like having Hugh Laurie starring in a game about an unprofessional doctor solving medical mysteries that no one else can. While on the topic of America, that's another big change-up that goes along with all this, that needs to be at least mentioned, as Judgment is the first game within the series, not counting Fist of the North Star, to get an English dub since Yakuza 1. Why has the series never done a dub since, you might be asking?
Azuki-san!
How many times I gotta tell you, I'm not Yakuza. You retarded or just deaf?
In comparison to their first, let's say, attempt,
Dojima Oyabun will see you in hell!
Judgment handled its dub incredibly well, even holding up to the original Japanese.
八神だ。カムロ町の八神探偵事務所。
It's Yagami. Take a good look. Now do you believe me?
Despite being a series firmly set in Japan and Japanese culture, the voices capture the feeling of the story and setting, which can be tough considering how many tones these games can bounce between. Sure, some of the lip syncing isn't always on point, but the voice direction and translation definitely are. No one sounds out of place or miscast either, using a giant assortment of top-tier English voice actors that most would probably at least somewhat recognize, like Steve Bloom, Matt Mercer, and Crispin Freeman, along with a few obscure ones. But possibly the best casting was with Greg Chun as Detective Yagami, who fit the overall tone of the character perfectly, balancing the troubled melodrama of his story with a bit of dry sarcasm.
And? You still want to sue? You know, you won't know what hit you.
In terms of writing, Judgment definitely has a lot of the markings of a Yakuza game, with characters vying for expensive land and a chapter-focused structure, which isn't a bad thing per se, as it still makes use of its new characters within that style. Because of its different framing, Judgment's story as a whole is set up to be rather morally gray, focusing on the complicated legal and political systems of Japan and how one finds justice within, which is a great shift in perspective for this universe, as in the past, it more often focused on those that existed outside of the law. Every character in Judgment has their own unique ideologies and justification for why they do what they do, and how that factors into the larger plot, ranging between dirty cops simply looking out for themselves, prosecutors willing to look the other way for what they see as the greater good, aging Yakuza patriarchs just trying to maintain a status quo, and doctors working towards pushing medical science further. Even the antagonists have a goal that you can quite easily sympathize with, since it's fighting for something a lot of people can relate to, leading to questions of where the line is for doing the right thing. Outside of a character or two missing one scene for a bit of resolution, everyone within the story ends up playing an important role leading up to the final moments of the game. With that said though, the pacing of the story can be a bit wonky at times, because between story missions, you're forced into doing unrelated side cases while other characters do their own investigation before you can progress, which disrupts the flow of the mysteries being unveiled and makes certain story beats drag along. I mean, I appreciate getting more out of Kaito, I love this man, and seeing him become Captain Cop is great, but he has two separate main story cases that ultimately don't feed into the larger narrative, making what could have been good character development if you were doing it as a separate side case on your own, into what ultimately comes down to padding. Going along with that shift in narrative perspective I mentioned a couple minutes ago, there is also a change to the gameplay perspective, as placing a crime drama like this in the crime-riddled streets of Kamurocho was an idea that had a lot of potential for interesting design changes. In the Yakuza games, there's a particular rhythm to how they progress, boiling down to story, running around, fight, side mission, story, fight. with the occasional introduction to a new minigame for side content and world building. With Judgment though, there's a new aspect slipped in between with investigations and general detective work, which really changes the overall flow and feeling of the game by comparison. This includes classic trademarks of detective work such as IDing potential suspects in a crowd, reconnaissance, going undercover, tailing people of interest, and photographing evidence. But most importantly, this comes through in scene inspections and case solving. Like any detective game worth its salt, Judgment pushes you to be perceptive to figure out solutions. Maybe not to the level of LA Noire, but it really tries to put you in the shoes of a detective working the streets. There's the general footwork involved in pursuing clues, going to find witnesses that might have key info, and chasing down those that might not want to talk. You're even rewarded for being astute and following how cases unfold by asking the right questions during conversations, or deducing how to get to the next location by going through the clues you get. Then once you get to the crime scenes, there's looking for clues, which is taking a lot of notes from the Phoenix Wright series, to the point that if Capcom was looking into legal actions, I wouldn't really question it. The devs even included the iconic mechanic of aimlessly clicking through a crime scene when you aren't sure what you're supposed to be looking for. But it's once you start to piece those clues that you have together and reach a solution, along with the sheer amount of different aspects that factor into getting there, that really nails this feeling of the modern detective the game is going for, especially in regards to the main story itself. Because of this new context, there's now even a great in-universe justification for doing side quests, as they come in the form of jobs that Yagami takes on, ranging from catching cheating husbands to investigating sleazy producers. Yagami isn't doing any of this work solely out of the kindness of his heart, but because it's his job. I mean, he's got rent to not pay. However, as much as I can wax poetic about the detective aspects of the game, it's definitely not perfect. As you can tell, the devs don't have a lot of experience in this style of game design, mixing in with what they're used to doing. The tailing missions, for example, while giving the vibe of a detective sneaking around to find evidence on a mark, ends up dominating a good amount of the actual detective work, regularly boiling down to a lot of waiting around for your target to move along, and then rushing to follow them once they turn a corner. Outside of this just getting repetitive, part of this issue has to go with the fact that Kamurocho isn't designed to make the most out of this type of gameplay, being that it's all straight city streets, with nearly nothing to utilize for stakeouts or surveillance. It makes you question why you can't use Yagami's drone either, as that would have added a third dimension to these sections. Also, as much as I enjoy the Ace Attorney style of investigations, they aren't exactly stressing your cognitive abilities to the max, as they typically give you a set of predetermined clues from the ones you've collected, thus making the correct answer an obvious one. If someone was looking for a game that really tested them on their detective skills, I'd probably point them towards something like Danganronpa over Judgment. But to be fair, Judgment isn't only about casework, because it's not a game made by the Yakuza team if you can't crush a man's skull into the pavement 3 different ways. In all honesty, and this is purely my own subjective opinion on it, so you know it's right, Judgment has one of the best combat systems RGG Studios has developed yet, right up there with Yakuza 0. While it keeps Yakuza's classic square-square triangle-triangle combos, where Kiryu plays like a bulldozer slamming through other men with his rugged body, Yagami has a snappier feel to the way he fights, basing his moveset on his background in Kung Fu, modeling it after the real-life Baji Quan martial art with its focus on elbow strikes and open fists, while mixing in some street fighting parkour for good measure. Between punching enemies halfway down the block and chugging back a full ball of jack to go full drunken fist, Yagami's playstyle is best described as diverse, meaning somewhere between Kiryu's sturdiness and Majima's erraticness, especially once you get into the late game and unlock all his EX moves and combo finishers, as that's where it gets the most fleshed out, fully utilizing his moves by taking advantage of his surroundings and the amount of people he's fighting. Though, to balance his versatility out, because Yagami isn't the superhuman monster that Kiryu is, weapons were designed to be a more genuine threat, not just because of the inherent damage of getting a sword to the face, but because that damage can be permanent, requiring a doctor visit or medical kit to take care of it, which adds to Yagami's inherent vulnerability, since taking a couple gunshots can remove more than a third of his health bar, which can put you in a dangerous place. On harder difficulties, even random thugs will start carrying around swords and guns that can do serious damage, requiring a lot of care to how you approach these fights, making Yagami's greater mobility an invaluable tool since you can't simply rush forward at the problem. But you can't let it drag out either, because if you're in a fight too long, bystanders will start to call the cops, who will then try to nab you and give you a fine for causing trouble if you're caught, which is an interesting detail, though it takes about 90 seconds before the police actually arrive, which is twice as long as most of these street fights last outside of the tougher difficulty settings. So there's a good chance this might be the first time some players are even hearing about it. But it's details like that, or shops refusing to serve you if fights end up wrecking their business, that reflects that fights outside in the open like this don't happen independent from the rest of the city, and actions have repercussions if they start to affect others. Yagami is a normal, or as normal as Kamurocho gets, citizen, so he can behave like a Yakuza tough guy getting into fights without others taking notice. As much as I enjoy it though, I do have my gripes with Judgment's combat. To start, Yagami's moveset is broken into two styles, Tiger and Crane, one for powerful one-on-one hits, and the other for sweeping attacks aimed at larger groups. This is a design I really dig, because just like the three styles in Yakuza 0, it's more variety and options in what you can do in fights. However, while it has its usability, Crane style doesn't end up holding up to Tiger, especially the further you get in. Going from the endgame back to the start for comparison's sake, Crane is effectively the same outside of a couple strength and speed bonuses, where Tiger's capabilities are nearly halved, as it's missing Flux Fissure, counters, and charge combo finishers, along with the ability to power through hits, which really shows how much more attention went into designing Tiger over Crane. While on the note of minor design flaws, the amount of recycled heat moves does also take away from the uniqueness of Yagami's playstyle, as a lot are ripped straight out of previous Yakuza games. There admittedly isn't a lot of ways to hit someone with a sign or traffic cone, but slamming an enemy with an object and then belly flopping onto them just doesn't feel like a thing Yagami would do, considering the rest of his moves are largely based on kung fu motions and properly utilizing his surroundings in efficient ways. But one of the biggest issues I can direct at the combat is that it's overutilized. Now, this isn't me saying that I don't like it. The core concept of mixing Yakuza and Ace Attorney, balancing between crazy action sequences and courtroom drama, is one I'm a big fan of. But with how it was done, the combat does end up undermining the investigative aspects of the game. Despite playing up how Yagami is your classic sleuth-type character, using all the tools at his disposal to investigate crime, the amount of times a situation devolves into Yagami kicking someone's teeth in ends up detracting from the sly detective side of his character. I love the combat, but as I said earlier, Yagami isn't Kiryu, so there really wasn't a need to focus on it so much as if he was, since it ended up overshadowing the detective elements of the story at times. Like, why is Yagami fighting this group of doctors that don't have anything to do with what's going on? Didn't we get a disguise here to avoid fighting? Wasn't barging in to fight an entire building of Yakuza the kind of thing that was scoffed at the start of the game? Now, I'm sure that point isn't going to sit well with some, because who doesn't love solving problems by breaking it over a street post? So I'm going to balance it out by bringing up one of the things Judgment does best, and that's the world that it builds. At this point, being the level designer at RGG must be one of the slickest jobs in the industry, as they're simply recreating the same 10 city block area every time, using the same map of Kamurocho since Yakuza 1, but updating the aesthetics of it and sometimes in a new engine. There's Millennium Tower, there's the batting cages, and the most important staple of the city, swaths of gang violence and weird perverts. To the dev's credit though, this is easily the most realized and fleshed out the district has ever been, now that their recent in-house Dragon engine allows you to fully explore it without any sort of load screens separating off stores and buildings, creating one seamless world to explore like in Yakuza 6. There's a certain coziness to returning to the streets of Kamurocho within the new context of solving cases as Yagami. And it's not just the ability to walk into any shop uninterrupted that makes the difference, but how the NPCs play into it. Friendly NPCs have been part of the Yakuza series for the last few entries at this point now, where you can find characters throughout the city to help out and go through a brief storyline with. And Judgment takes this to the next level, by including a total of 50 unique people you can meet and make friends with throughout the game, really incentivizing fully exploring the world and experiencing everything there is to it. From going to play darts over at the Sega arcade, to having drinks over at Bantam, to learning how to play Mahjong. Look, they aren't all great, okay? A decent portion of these friendships are built up by buying food or items from their shop, making some of those 50 more or less fluff. But even then, it's not the amount of them alone that's important, but how integral they become to Yagami's work and how it plays into the setting itself. Some NPCs will back you up in a fight once you've befriended them, either directly or by giving you an assist if you're close to their shop, helping you clean up the streets of gang members that pop up. You regularly check in on a business and places around town to see how your friends are doing, and Yagami's landlady will even leave food she made in his fridge to try out, all of which feeds into this friendly neighborhood detective thing Yagami has going on. This even ties into the detective work itself too, because you need recognition to get more cases. So word spreads about your talents as a detective through the connections you make with others and the jobs you do, which in turn leads to more cases, and sometimes more connections afterwards, creating a cycle that can start off from a single job about stopping a perverted panty thief that can spin off into multiple friendships, relations, and other cases. As a key example, you can't fully befriend Madoka over at the Apple Pie Hostess Club until you can handle multiple drinks around her, and you complete her old friend Yosuke's storyline, which requires setting up Madoka with 4 possible clients that can help her earn enough money to get out of hosting. And those 4 clients are all friends you've made around town, all of which can't be done until near the end of the game, despite a lot of it starting around chapter 2 or 3. Friendships and side cases aren't isolated stories that are simply done and then you move on to the next. They're interwoven into each other and into Yagami's own work, making Kamurocho this fleshed out little world full of people you get to know and help out. But in this fully fleshed out Kamurocho, where you can make friends and grow a business, hides my most substantial problem with Judgment, that shows an utter lack of care for its players and world building. And that's, you can't date Sayori.
I'll do it. I'll be Kamurocho's #1 hostess.
I mean, sure, Yagami's ex is her best friend, and that's awkward, and you have 4 other women to date, which Yakuza's never done before, and that's great and all, but come on, you're gonna allow me to play her, do a dress-up game where I can make her into her best version, and then say psych. That's just mean.
I'm sure, Saki. Nice to meet you.
All Sayori-related complaints aside, Judgment is a perfect case study of a game trying to break free from the legacy of its predecessor. For every new thing it pushes, it ends up doubling down on the old format that the Yakuza games did, which at times feels like it's being pulled in 2 directions. I'll admit that even I'm part of the problem here, as I honestly had a lot of troubles not comparing everything it did to the Yakuza games. For how much I do genuinely adore this game, with Judgment, you get the strong sense that the dev team were grappling with trying to push the envelope of what their series is, without possibly going too far and eliminating their fanbase who love that style of game. And that's a tough balancing act. To their credit, outside of a reference to an event that happens in 6, and the existence of the Tojo clan in the background of the story, there's almost no mention of anything specifically related to the Yakuza games, which could have made for an easy pop from fans if they did. Kiryu doesn't make a cameo in a side case, there's no Majima fights. Judgment was treated to be its own thing within this universe. Yet, it's still firmly holding on to that past. I do admit I'll miss the Dragon of Dojima and the Yakuza of Kamurocho, but Judgment shows a lot of potential for new ventures by RGG Studio, and how much they can really do with this style of game while still playing up their strengths. It can be tough to appeal to longtime fans of something while trying new formats, but I do genuinely hope that next time they try to push past this in order to make something truly unique. Because it's worth remembering, that's how we got the Yakuza games in the first place. Anyway, thanks for watching. A special thanks to my patrons over at Patreon, as well as to Skillshare for supporting the video. So if you aren't already aware, Skillshare is an online learning community with thousands of classes, covering dozens of creative and entrepreneurial skills taught by experts in their field. As you can tell from my upload schedule, I'm terrible for procrastinating. So I recently took a class in productivity that taught me a lot of good habits to develop, which included a few tips that I used to make sure this video was out on time. So if you want to be like me, try Skillshare, all for less than $10 a month. Click the link in the description below to get 2 months of Skillshare Premium for free to try it out yourself.
Someone send help.